Okay, welcome to this online recording of our Introduction to the Energy Support Service presentation. This is for anyone who wasn't available to attend on the day. So just to introduce you to myself, my name's Ollie. I recently joined Cambridgeshire ACRE as a sustainability advisor. I've worked in sustainability for about 2.5 years, and most of that time has been focused on energy and renewable energy. I'm an associate member of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, and yeah, I'm very much looking forward to kind of getting involved in this role, working with community buildings and seeing how this project progresses over the next 3 years. So the purpose for this session is to give you a bit more information about the project, the sustainability service and the support which is available, and give you an idea of how we can hopefully work with you to make your hall more efficient, save some energy, and ultimately save costs. In terms of the agenda for today, we're going to look at why sustainability matters. We're going to introduce the support service. We're going to run through the process for the energy audits in a bit more detail. And then we're going to look at some kind of energy saving measures and tips, as well as how do you go about collecting your energy data, creating a baseline which you can work from, and as you'll see, is also part of the audit. So yeah, let's get into things. If I can skip my slides. There we go. So the Futureproofing Cambridgeshire Community Buildings project, this is where the energy support sits under. It's a 3-year project. It's funded by the National Lottery with match funding from DEFRA and Cambridgeshire ACRE membership fees. The project runs for 3 years, and there's 2 key strands of support to the project. The governance side of things is led by my colleague Lisa, who I'm sure a lot of you already know. The sustainability energy advice side of things, that's where I come in. On that side of things, the goal is to support around 50 or so community buildings to help you become more energy resilient, energy efficient, and also fit for future. This idea of future proofing, I think, is really important. So we're going to do that through energy audits, tailored support, advice, basically helping you along that journey. We're also, as part of the project, we've got a steering group. So that steering group is made up of 6 trustees from community buildings across Cambridgeshire, and that just ensures that they're giving us that kind of direction to make sure everything we're doing is suitable for community buildings. Basically, what we're offering is shaped by your needs rather than us making assumptions on what might be needed. So very quickly, we're just going to cover why sustainability matters. The main thing I think for a lot of people will be the rising energy costs. Buildings are becoming more and more expensive to heat. I think for a lot of community buildings now, it is the biggest single running cost. When you're trying to balance that with keeping things affordable for groups who want to use the hall, whilst covering your own overheads, I think that can become quite difficult. There's also kind of growing pressure and opportunities to reduce your environmental impact. Obviously, the government's got their net zero targets. Those are long-term targets. But I think more and more we're seeing things like funders are looking for evidence of sustainability initiatives and improvements. As well as that, I think village halls, community buildings have a really good or a really unique opportunity to set a really positive example for communities and to engage local residents to build that awareness around energy efficiency. So yeah, it's an opportunity to provide a good example for your community. So in terms of the actual support available, there's 4 key areas, and there is, as you'll see, there's a little bit of kind of overlap here. The key one, I suppose, is the tailored energy audits. So this is an in-depth assessment of your building. We come out, we look at the building itself, but we're also looking at things like your energy usage, your occupancy, and so how often is that building getting used? And what that allows us to do is to look at those key areas of improvement, to calculate the potential savings that could come from each of those, and also to put all of that information basically into a written report, which you've then got. The action plan will hopefully work with you to take the recommendations from that report. That can obviously be, for some buildings, that will be a few different things and it might seem quite achievable. For other buildings, obviously depending on things like funding, time, resources, that kind of thing, that list of potential improvements might seem much longer and much more unachievable. So the idea of the action plan is we'll work with you, we'll work out a prioritized kind of list of actions. We'll break each of those kind of potential measures down into more manageable actions that you can take, and we'll work with you over the 3 years that this project's running to kind of help you achieve those things. As well as the action plans, we're offering funding advice and one-to-one support. So the funding advice side of things, we can help you to identify funding sources for your projects. We can help you with things like reviewing grant applications, and we can also offer one-to-one support on effectively any, and it's more kind of ad hoc, the one-to-one support, but it's anything that you feel you need a bit of support with, whether it's just a soundboard, someone to say, look, we've had these 3 quotes, we're not quite sure how they compare, say it's solar panels, they've each put in a slightly different size system in their quotes, how do we kind of compare them, what's your opinion? Or it could be something a little bit more technical, it could be kind of the process of how these things are installed. That one-to-one support is really determined by you, but I think we're expecting a lot of it will come around that kind of suppliers, and those are the key barriers that we see are normally finance and finding a trusted supplier. So yeah, that's a very quick overview of the support which is available. We'll go into things in a bit more detail now, starting with the process for those energy audits. So the first stage of that audit process is basically finding out a little bit more about your aims for the audit. Why is it you want to undertake it? What is it you're trying to achieve? Are there any specific areas of concern or opportunity? And then, as well as that, we'll ask you to complete a quick survey. That just gives us a bit of background information on your building, the kind of systems you've got in place at the moment in terms of things like heating, lighting, that kind of thing. We'll also ask you to provide ideally 12 months of energy data, past energy data. So again, we'll look at that later in the session today, how you can kind of collect that data. But what that does is that makes sure that the recommendations we're giving you are tailored to your building and also your energy use, your occupancy patterns, just to make sure those savings calculations, those estimates we give you are accurate. What we don't want is we don't want to tell you that, look, you can install such and such a measure, you can expect this return, and then actually we've not taken into account, oh, well, the hall's only used 5 hours per week, and actually those projected savings aren't quite what we anticipated. So I think the more data we can gather in that initial kind of stage, the better. And like I say, we'll look into that in a bit more detail later. The next thing we'll do once we've got all that data from you, we'll do a bit of a remote analysis, a desktop analysis. We'll look at all the energy data you've sent us. We'll look for any patterns or kind of anomalies in that. We can benchmark it against typical figures. So we can look at things like so the kilowatt hours of energy used per metre squared, because obviously every community building is slightly different, but that just gives us, as I say, a benchmark of kind of where you're at. We can also do a lot on a desktop basis in terms of viability, kind of looking at what might be possible. So if we look at a Google Maps or a satellite image, we can obviously see, say, your roof space, and it might be that your roof faces north, it's very shaded, and we know pretty well before we get there that it's probably not going to be suitable for solar panels. So again, it's just kind of anything we can do before we get there to build up that background picture of your building and how you use energy at the moment, that really helps, because obviously when we're on the site visit, things tend to move very quickly. You never get as long as you want, so any information we can get beforehand does help. And then in terms of the site visit itself, so obviously we'll do an inspection of the building fabric, so that's things like your walls, roof, floor, windows, doors, effectively those elements of your building where heat is lost. That's what we're going to be looking at really. We'll also look at the kind of the systems that we mentioned. So things like heating, what kind of heating system have you got? What condition is it in? How is it controlled is a really big one as well. So a lot of this we can really get into the finer details on that site visit, and we can see exactly how things work. So yeah, as I say, the other thing we'll be looking at is renewable technologies. So those are the key areas these audits look at: is what kind of condition is your building in, how well is it retaining that heat, how could we potentially improve how well it does retain the heat, and then as well as that, what kind of heating or lighting, that kind of even cooling, if you've got cooling, what are those systems at the moment, what are the potential for improvements in terms of efficiency, and then finally, how can we use renewable technologies to help supplement those energy efficiencies? How can we generate energy on site if that's applicable? So once we've done that, we will take all of that data away. We'll look at the best solutions for your building. We'll calculate the impact of each of those kind of potential improvements. So in terms of the actual energy saved, the cost savings and the carbon savings, and we can give you estimates of what each of those would cost. Obviously, these are based on benchmark figures, kind of typical figures. So it is going to vary based on your building and the specific requirements there. But hopefully that gives you an idea of the payback periods for each of these improvements. And again, that will help us when we look at that action plan, when we look at prioritising things. That can be really useful to look at the different potential paybacks. And if we've only got a set budget, what's the best bang for buck? So yeah, that'll all go into that audit report. The audit report will be bespoke for your hall, obviously, so all the work we've done up until that point gets fed into the report. It's aimed at everyone who might be involved in your community building. You might have someone who's very technically minded, wants to look into all the detail, wants to get into the nerdy stuff like I do. You might have someone who actually they're just interested in the figures. It's like I say, it's a case of we've got X amount of pounds to spend. Where can we get the best value for money? So for each of those reports, we'll have an executive summary which breaks down those potential improvements, and then all the details, all the technical stuff will be in the appendices. So hopefully it makes it nice and easy to digest. And then as well as that, there's obviously follow-up support on hand. So once you've had a chance to read the report, before we organise that action plan meeting, we want to just make sure that you've understood it, you're happy with it. If there's any questions you've got, we can clarify those. And then once we've done that, we're ready to kind of start looking at prioritising those actions. So how do we take what's in the report and make it achievable for your building? So that's where the action plan comes in. As I say, we're here to help you identify what's achievable. That will depend on your finances, your resourcing, how much time's available, all sorts of things basically. What kind of plans have you got in the future? So if you know in 10 years' time your roof's going to need replacing, okay, well maybe we can put that into our action plan so that we know that closer to that time, maybe that's when we look at solar panels, all those kind of things. And this action plan is a working document, so the hope is that you'll come back to it. You'll update it as you go, and it helps to helps to break down those improvements into small and manageable actions. What we often see is people are drawn to a specific technology. So normally it's solar panels. I mean, it's one which everyone kind of, if you're looking to reduce your energy bills, obviously solar panels are a great way to do that, but they're not always a silver bullet, and they're not always the first thing you should be looking at. You might find that something like LED lighting actually provides you a much better return on your investment. So we can work with you with that action plan to kind of help to put things into a logical order, and if we need to, we can phase in the improvements as well. So that's the action plan in itself. There's a bit of a template there. Obviously yours will be different. And then in terms of the one-to-one support which is available, so as I mentioned earlier, there's advice around funding, finding funding, also helping you to kind of put in the strongest applications you can. So we can help you to pick out the information from your audit report which funders will want to see, which will strengthen that application. We can also review your grant applications. So if you want to send those over to us before you send them off, we're more than happy to look through them, give you any constructive feedback we can. We're going to be putting together a directory of installers. If there is anyone that you've used, this doesn't necessarily have to be energy efficiency. This can be maintenance, general improvements. If there's anyone you've used who you'd recommend, please do get in touch with us, let us know their details, and we can add them to that directory. We're also looking at a peer mentoring scheme. So we want to put together a team of green mentors. So these are people who have an interest or some experience in sustainability, and they're willing to pass that experience on to other village hall trustees, community building committees. So again, if you're interested, you know anyone who might be interested, please do get in contact. And then the only thing I've missed there is that one-to-one support. Like I say, it could effectively be anything which you think we can help with. I'm anticipating that it's going to be kind of around some of the more specific stuff, but really it's quite open-ended. We're here to support if we can, even if it's just doing some of the legwork. If there's something we don't know, we can do the research, we can come back to you. So yeah, if there's anything that you think we can help with, please do get in contact. And then on the funding side of things, we're just going to have a look at a couple of these in more detail, just as they're quite relevant to when this presentation was put together. Depending on when you're watching this, these may or may not still be relevant, I'm afraid, but if you're watching this quite quickly, then do have a look into these. The first one is the Zero Carbon Communities Grant from South Cambridgeshire District Council. This is £2,000 to £15,000 for non-profit groups, and that funding, it's been running since 2019, and previously many community buildings have used it to fund energy efficiency improvements. So there's a bit of a track record there. It's a good one if you're in that district. It's a good one to look into if you haven't had it before. The deadline is coming up quite quickly, so it's 1st of July, and you have to use that funding within 12 months. But again, if you're watching this at a later date and you're in South Cambridgeshire, do have a look at their website. It's usually open. Like I said, it's been running for quite a few years now, so it might be that actually 2025 you've missed the application deadline, but 2026 maybe we can look to put in a application for then. The other one, just to flag up for now, is the Platinum Jubilee Fund from National ACRE. So these are grants from £7,500 to £75,000 for modernisation and improvement. So this, again, is wider than just energy efficiency upgrades, but if you can include anything energy efficiency related in your application, then it's a good thing. One thing to flag with this one is that the grants are for 20% of the total project. So you have to know where you can get the rest of the 80% of that funding. And obviously with the minimum grant being £7,500, at 20% that makes the minimum project £37,500. So these are slightly larger projects, if you like. Other funding sources that we might look into are things like the National Lottery. They've got their Awards for All programme, which is up to £20,000, I think it is. And they've definitely funded things in the past, like solar panels for community buildings. There's also landfill operators. They have their own grant scheme. So Veolia, Talia, if you're within a certain distance of their facilities, then they have grant schemes which you can apply to. Those boundaries are quite strict. I learned that recently. We had a building which was, I think it was 10.5 miles from one of the facilities, and the radius is 10 miles. We spoke to them and there was nothing they could do. So you do have to be within the certain boundaries, but if you are, again, they're a really good one to apply to. Also Section 106 funding, if that's available to you, that's a good route to go down. And there's also loan schemes. So the big issue, they have their energy saving loan scheme, and there's also social investment business. They have what they call the Energy Resilience Fund. So this is like a hybrid. So it's a 60% loan and a 40% grant. So covers the total project cost. 40% if grant funded, 60% you do have to pay back. Obviously with the loans, there's interest rates, there's kind of arrangement fees to look into. So it's one of those that is obviously, maybe it's not quite as good as grant funding, but if you've got a larger project, it's a good one to look into. So that's just a couple of funding things which are available at the moment. We skip forwards. The other thing I just want to flag up was, as I say, we're putting together a trusted directory of your installers. In the meantime, I just want to flag up a couple of the accreditation schemes which are out there already if you are looking at energy efficiency improvements. So the first one is the National Installation Association, which is not that easy to say. The NIA, as I'll call it, is the trade body. It covers all different types of installation. It sets standards for installers. And there's also, if you are looking at installation, there's also the Cavity Installation Guarantee Agency, or CIGA, CIGA. This covers cavity wall insulation, and if you have an install by one of their registered installers, you basically get a 25-year guarantee on that install. Both of those have an installer list on their website, and there's links in this presentation, which will be available with this recording. The next one is the Microgeneration Certification Scheme, or MCS, you might have heard of. You might have heard of like an MCS certificate. This is related to renewable energy. So if you're looking at installing things like solar panels, wind turbines, even heat pumps, you might have heard of MCS and MCS certificates. What you have is you have an MCS certified installer, and what they do, their installations are basically they're certified to meet safety and quality standards, and it's similar in a way, I guess, to something like building regs. So if you've ever had building work done and you get your completion certificate at the end, it's the same thing with MCS. If your MCS certified installer has done the installation, they sign it off, you get an MCS certificate at the end to say it's all been done in line with those standards. And that's actually a requirement for things like the boiler upgrade scheme, which is the scheme from the government, which is £7,500 towards installing a heat pump if you've got a fossil fuel heating system. But also things like the smart export guarantee, which is if you want to export and sell the basically your solar generation which you're not using, if you want to export that back to the grid, then a requirement of that is that you have an MCS certificate for your solar install. There is another scheme called FlexiOrb, but it's less popular. It's not accepted by every energy provider. So the energy provider is the one who gives you your smart export guarantee certificate, and that's where the MCS is probably a better scheme if you're going down that road. The other one I wanted to flag here was the Green Register. So this is an independent scheme. It covers sustainable construction. The members directory on there, that has a lot of architects, it has builders, tradespeople, that kind of thing. The interesting thing I think about this one is that it's not just like a list of suppliers. The members, the people on that list, they have to actually go along to training. I think it's 2 days of Green Register training they have to do each year to show their commitment to learning. So that's another one to look into, see if there's anyone in your area. I think that brings us. So obviously we haven't got Graham here today, but what I'll do is I'll link wherever you're finding this recording. I'll make sure we've got links to this slide deck, but also Graham's slide deck. They've done an incredible amount of work at Little Thetford Village Hall. They've done quite a very well planned phased programme of improvements over the last 3 years or so. A lot of it grant funded. So yeah, do have a look through that slide deck, and they've kindly shared with us some future plans which are really exciting. So I'll add that into the kind of notes wherever you're finding this recording. Right, we're back. So part 2, we're going to look at some of the more practical sides of things. So we're going to look at the energy saving hierarchy. This is a bit of a structure of how you can think about improvements and the order you might want to do things. We're also going to look at how you can start measuring your energy and how you can create a baseline for your building. And then we're going to speak about some next steps, what you can take away from today and what you can get going with. So let's jump into this. So I just wanted to share, first of all, a couple of visuals from the Centre for Sustainable Energy. They've got some really good documents on their website, specifically for community buildings. So I'll link those in the notes below this presentation. But yeah, I want to show you this. So this is energy use in community buildings. This is kind of typical energy use by area. So as you can see there, by far the biggest energy user in your buildings will probably be space heating. So as it says there, heating up the spaces, keeping it warm for people who are using the buildings. Next up would be lighting, and then electrical appliances and water heating kind of making up the remainder. This is obviously going to vary by building, but it's just good to keep this in mind as we're going through everything else, that this is kind of typical usage. So the next slide shows us the energy saving hierarchy. Again, this is from the Centre for Sustainable Energy. And what this is for me, this is a really good structure of how you should be looking at making these improvements. Obviously, it's at the end of the day, it's up to you how you want to do things. A lot of people will effectively start from the bottom. They'll go straight for solar panels, say. It's not necessarily a problem, but from my point of view, I'd encourage you to, again, think about it in this way if you can. So we'll run through each of these in a little bit more detail, but just so you kind of know what we're talking about. Energy saving, that's those at the very top, energy saving, that's those low and zero cost behaviours. It's your low hanging fruit. It's the measures you can take really easily, fairly cheaply, which will have an improvement on your energy efficiency. So it's the things you should look at first. Next, we'd look at building fabric. So as we mentioned earlier, this is walls, floors, those kind of things. Basically looking at insulation levels, how much of that heat can we keep in? Then we'd look at space and hot water heating. So in terms of the systems themselves, as we saw in that previous slide, that pie chart, space heating was by far 70% of your energy usage. So the more we can do around heating, the better. So we'd look at the actual system itself as well as the controls. And then finally, we'd look at things like renewable energy. So solar panels, even heat pumps would come under renewable energy as well. They kind of obviously, that crosses over into the space heating. But yeah, effectively, once we've looked at everything else, okay, how can we use renewables to supplement everything else we've done? So if we start looking at these in a bit more detail, so in terms of the energy saving behaviours, this is things like switch off routines, so making sure that you've got those routines in place for lights, appliances, heating, etc., so that people know when they should be off and who's responsible for turning those off. It might be that you have, I don't know, a caretaker who comes and locks up the building at night. Do they need to go around, turn everything off? Is it that you have signage and you tell hirers they need to turn things off when they're done at the end of the day? Also things like making sure windows and doors are closed in cold weather. I know some of these will seem really basic, really obvious, but particularly for yourselves where you're running community buildings and other people are using them, you'd be surprised how often someone will open a window rather than try and adjust the heating if they're a bit too warm. So there's things you can do there around kind of managing the controls as well. So as I say, helping hirers to understand what their responsibilities are, whether that's signage, whether that's part of your hire agreement, making sure they understand, if they need to, they understand how to control things like the heating, the lighting, so that they're not using energy unnecessarily. These are all the kind of behavioural things that we can do before we even look at spending money. When we are ready to start looking at spending money, we want to look at kind of those low cost measures. So that's things like draft proofing. So drafts and infiltration is the kind of fancy word for it. Accounts for about 10% of heat loss. Excuse me. So we want to seal around any doors and windows as well as we can, so you've not got that cold air coming in, or similarly in hot weather, you haven't got that hot air coming in making the building too warm, creating a need for cooling systems, which obviously use energy. If you haven't got drafts, you can still use things like heavy curtains. So what they'll do, they'll keep that cold air inside the recess of the window effectively, so it's not coming into the room as much. Also things like LED lighting we class as a low cost measure. Obviously if you need to replace all the lighting in the hall and there's wiring to go with that, then that can get expensive, but LED lighting is another one of those kind of low-hanging fruits. If you haven't already upgraded your lighting, it's something we definitely look at. It provides a really good return on investment. And obviously you don't have to replace it all at once. If you know that your lights in, say, the main hall, those are the ones which get used most, then you can just replace them, and you'll probably see a really good improvement just from that. Also things like sub-metering. So this might not necessarily create a energy saving in itself, but if it can help you to better understand how you're using energy in your building, that can lead to efficiencies. So if you know that you have, I don't know, we've worked with halls before or buildings before, where you have like a bar area and that is run separately, but actually they don't have their own metering. So all they're doing is basically accounting for a certain percentage of the energy use is attributed to that bar. Whereas actually if you can sub-meter it, you can basically see exactly what's going through to that area. They can pay for the energy they use, and actually you can then either support them to become more efficient, or you can focus solely on your own efficiency, without always having this thing of, well, we're doing everything we can, but actually the bar is probably the biggest user of energy, and it's kind of what we're doing doesn't quite have the impact. By using things like sub-metering, you can really get into that kind of nitty-gritty if you need to. And then the only other one to mention there is kind of a cheaper way to do it is smart plugs. So not quite at the same scale, but if you're just looking at specific appliances, you can get smart plugs which will plug into a normal plug socket, and then you effectively put your plug into it. So the power comes through the smart plug into the plug as normal. And that allows you to do two things which are quite useful from an energy efficiency point of view. Number one is you can control them via your phone. so you can make sure that things are turned off remotely without having to go to the building. And number 2 is it will actually track how much energy usage goes through that plug. So you can leave that plugged in for a week, a month, however long you want, and you can see exactly how many kilowatts have been used by that appliance which has been plugged in. So that can be really useful as well. And then touching on building fabric, we do have an online session next month. Well, depending when you're watching this again, sorry. We have an online session in July with Ben Stagg, who is an architect who's helped National ACRE develop a net zero guide for community buildings. So a lot of this will cover in more detail there, but just to quickly kind of touch on what we're talking about. Building fabric is effectively your walls, your floor, your roof, your windows and doors, all those parts of the building where you'll be losing heat. And there's a little diagram there in the top right hand corner that shows you where you lose heat. So the biggest heat loss will be through your walls. And for some people that's surprising, because most people, we think of hot air rising, it's probably escaping through the roof. But if you think about a building, think about your own home or the buildings that you work with, the surface area of your walls is much larger than the surface area of your roof. So by square metre, yes, the roof is probably the highest proportion of heat loss. But actually, in terms of the building as a whole, it's the walls. As you can see there on the diagram, 25% roughly through the roof, 15% through the floor, and then 25% is through windows and doors, but that includes that 10% that we mentioned for kind of drafts and infiltration. So yeah, hopefully that gives you an idea of kind of where the heat might be lost. And again, every building's different, but there's a few other things you might want to think about as well when you're looking at building fabric. If the way we'd actually improve that practically is to improve the insulation levels, or in terms of windows and doors, we'd look to improve the glazing, so that less of that heat basically passes through each element, more is kept inside. The only problem with that, and particularly with things like draft proofing, is that you're effectively sealing that building better. So you have to consider ventilation, whether that's kind of natural ventilation, so things like windows, or whether it's mechanical ventilation through extractor fans. And then the only other thing to mention is shading. So a lot of buildings now, obviously, summers are getting hotter. Overheating is becoming more of a problem. So if you've got a building which has a lot of glazing on a south-facing wall, you might find that actually over summer that gets really, really hot. And obviously you can look at cooling systems, you can install aircon, you could even potentially install something like an air-to-air heat pump, which will do your heating in winter and cooling in summer with the same system. But actually kind of first line of defense would be to look at shading. So how could you shade those windows with things like canopies, or even natural shading with climbing plants and that kind of thing? How can you shade that to keep those sun rays coming in, stop that warming up? So that's something else we'd look at for building fabric. If we move on, moving down that hierarchy, so the next thing we'd look at is heating. In terms of heating, we're looking at the actual system itself. So what type of fuel are we using? Is that a gas boiler? Is it oil? Is it electric heating? What's the efficiency of that system? So if you've got an old boiler, say anything over roughly 15 years old, you could see a fairly decent improvement just by replacing that boiler with a modern condensing boiler. Obviously, from an environmental point of view, we'd encourage you to look at electrifying your heating, because electric has lower carbon emissions than things like oil and gas per kilowatt. So you could look at electric heating systems, and then we might consider what's the most efficient system for your building. A heat pump, for example, can be up to 300 times efficient. So for every 1 kilowatt of electric put in, you can generate 3 kilowatts of heat out. But actually, it comes back to those kind of that occupancy, that usage. If your building's not used that much, actually you might be better looking at, rather than heating that whole building all the time, which is kind of how heat pumps work. They run kind of low and slow. Are you better at looking at heating each room individually, potentially? Something like infrared panels work really well for some halls if you haven't got really high usage levels. They basically allow you to heat up rooms quite quickly as and when you need it. So you're not heating in between bookings. You're not having to keep that room warm when it's not being used. So yeah, that's where things like the audit come in. We can look at all those things. Hot water is a very similar situation. Really, it goes hand in hand. So we're thinking about things like, how is that hot water heated? What is the system? How is it controlled? That's one thing I suppose we didn't touch on for the heating as well. Sorry, was we really want to consider controls alongside the actual system itself. So have you got things like thermostats, timers? Have you got the TRV valves on radiators? Can we look at things like smart controls, or maybe even systems now which integrate with your booking system so that the hall is preheated to the temperature for the booking? There's some really clever things out there, and it's just working out what works best for your scenario. So yeah, going back to hot water, we'd look at the same kind of thing. How's the hot water controlled? When is it on? What temperature does it heat to? Those kind of things. Also, is at a very basic level, if you've got a hot water tank, is it well insulated? Is the pipework insulated? Those kind of things. And then also considering, would point of use heaters be more efficient? So rather than heating up a big tank of water all day, would it be better to have the point of use heaters where they're needed? So if you've got, say you've got a hall with just kind of a kitchen sink and some toilets, then you might be better to look at those point of use water systems. Obviously, if you've got a hall which has kind of showering facilities, that kind of thing, that's going to be a different scenario. So yeah, a lot of this you can see is very specific to your situation, and as I say, that's hopefully where the audits will be useful. And finally, renewables, renewable energy. Solar panels, obviously increasingly common. You see them on quite a few community buildings now. They're suitable in a lot of situations. You don't necessarily have to have like a south-facing roof. If you've got, say, a pitched roof, east and west, that works really well as well. As long as you're not too shaded and you're not directly north, then solar panels can work really well. It will depend on your energy use, kind of how financially viable they are. So the more of that energy you can use on site, the better. That's just because there's a difference between effectively what you pay for electricity and what you can export it for. So the more that you can generate and use on site, obviously the less energy you're buying. So the more kind of financial benefit there is there. And then similarly with batteries, it really depends on your energy usage, and for batteries specifically, when you're using that energy. Batteries are slightly different now in that we see people now, they're installing batteries not necessarily just to supplement a solar panel system and store that excess energy rather than selling it, but actually they're using it to take advantage of what's called time of use tariffs. So there's a lot of suppliers now, you'll have a tariff where you might have a cheaper rate. Usually you have one overnight and maybe one early afternoon. So that can be really good if you're looking at electric heating. Then if the same applies, but you can run your heating at those cheaper times, and with the cost of electric being much more than gas, those time of use tariffs can be really useful as a way of kind of making your heating system cheaper to run. In terms of batteries, what we're seeing people do is they will use those time of use tariffs. They'll effectively buy energy overnight at the cheap rate. They'll store it in the batteries, and then they'll use it throughout the day. Again, it's going to depend how much energy you're using when you're using it as well. But they can be a really good investment. Wind turbines I've put on here just because they obviously are a form of renewable energy, but they're not suitable for most buildings, particularly community buildings, which by their nature tend to be within a community. Wind turbines, especially the small ones, they require consistent, unrestricted wind flow. So if your building is in a village, in a town or anything, if it's kind of, unless it's quite an isolated site where you're getting those unrestricted wind flows come through, they don't work that efficiently. You're probably better in that case looking at solar panels. There's also a few more kind of planning restrictions around wind turbines. And then the other thing I've put on here is about green energy tariffs. So they won't necessarily save you money, but if you are coming at this from an environmental standpoint, if you're looking to improve your environmental performance, then a green energy tariff can be a really good way to do that. What you want to look for is a supplier who backs their tariff with 100% renewable generation. So some suppliers, they will effectively oversell the amount of renewable energy they're generating. So yeah, have a look around. You'll see that a lot of them, if they do it, they'll make it quite obvious that they are backed by that 100% renewable generation. So just moving on, there's just a few other things to consider when we're thinking about these kind of improvements. And a few of them we've touched on already, but the key ones, maintenance. So really you need to keep on top of your maintenance. Obviously whether you are or you aren't looking into energy efficiency improvements, but particularly if you're looking to make improvements, you want to make sure that that maintenance plan is in place first. So things like blocked gutters, cracks in render, broken windows, those kind of things, they can affect the efficiency of your building, effectively more heat escaping, or you've got cold and damp patches. By creating this medium to long term maintenance plan, thinking about who has responsibility for it, defining all of these kind of things, it puts you in a really good position. And it helps from our point of view as well, because we can work with you to fit in with those plans. So similar to the example I gave earlier, if you know in 10 years time that roof's going to need replacing, or say that roof's going to need replacing in the next 10 years, we might look at your energy usage and we might say, well, actually, we think solar panels would be a really good investment for you. Potentially you're not in a position to do it at the moment, but if we phased that and we did everything else first, as you saw in that energy hierarchy, if we do everything else and then we can look at solar panels in say 5 years, and actually when we're doing that and we've got the scaffolding up, it makes sense to do the re-roof at the same time, and potentially we can look to get grant funding for the whole thing, tying it in with the solar panels, potentially making it more appealing to grant funders. So yeah, having that maintenance plan in place is really, really, really useful, both for you and for us. Moisture, as we touched on earlier, as we're making these buildings more airtight, we are still generating moisture from things like people. We breathe out, we create moisture. If you've got cooking facilities, particularly if you've got things like showering facilities, these are all sources of moisture, and we want to make sure that that building can breathe and it can get rid of the moisture. This, like I said earlier, this can be either natural ventilation, so windows. It can be mechanical ventilations from extractor fans, and you can also get heat recovery units. So that is, you might have heard of these, mechanical ventilation heat recovery, MVHR. And what that does basically, it sucks that warm, moist air out, it removes the moisture, recycles the warm air back into the building, so that you're not, rather than drawing in the cold air from the outside, you're reusing that air, and it can help to keep the building warmer, so you're not using as much energy to heat it. So they can be really good in the right situation. And then the last thing to touch on is just permissions. So obviously certain things like external wall insulation will probably require planning permission. If you're in a listed building or a conservation area, obviously there's different requirements there. As well as thinking about, I guess, your internal governance as well. And I'm sure Lisa, who my colleague Lisa can kind of help you on those lines. Your own management committee, if you don't own the building, getting permission from the building owner. Obviously, we can give some quite generic advice, particularly around the kind of planning, listed buildings, conservation, that kind of stuff. Your best bet is to speak to your local council, speak to the planning department or conservation officers once you have determined what you'd like to do, and they can usually give you some more advice. Right, so we're going to move on now to the kind of measuring and creating a baseline for your energy use. This is just a quote that I quite like and often come back to in my own head. What gets measured gets managed. Very simple, but it's true, and it's very true of energy use. The more you start to look at this stuff and the more you can get into that routine of doing things like taking meter readings, the more you'll start to manage energy use and think about it more. So one thing I wanted to touch on was the importance of having this data for decision making. So as I mentioned earlier, for the energy audit, we ideally need 12 months of energy usage. So this shows us how you use energy over the whole year. This will come probably from energy bills. We'll have a look at that in more detail in a moment. But what this does, this allows us to give you accurate saving estimates for the improvements we're suggesting. Ultimately means that you can make better decisions of how to spend your money or grant money, whatever it is. We're kind of focusing on energy here, but we also need to think about usage patterns as well, how the kind of occupancy for your building. It's a little bit more difficult for us to provide you with templates and stuff for that because every system is a little bit different. What I'd recommend is whatever system you use, if it is something like Hallmaster, Lemon Booking, that kind of thing, go in there. There should be some sort of kind of reporting functionality. You should be able to draw back reports for past time periods, so that we can again start to build up that picture of when the hall is used. That's again really useful for us. If we, as well as knowing roughly how many hours per week, we ideally need to know exactly when. So if you tell us, oh yeah, the hall's used 15 hours per week, and we think, okay, that's a couple hours a day. Say there's a bit of energy use there. We look at your data. There's a bit of energy use. Okay, potentially solar panels would suit, but actually, when we break that down, that 15 hours, it all happens in the evening. Say it's all from 7 p.m. till 10 p.m. You've got a club who's in there every day. So what that means is, say in that situation, actually those solar panels probably aren't definitely on their own. They're not going to give you the savings that we would expect, just because your usage is not at the same time as your energy generation from the panels. So the more detail, basically what I'm trying to get across is the more detail you can give us, the better. The more we can make sure that data and those savings we give back to you are accurate. And what we want to encourage you to do is to create a baseline. So what this does, and there's tools available. We've got this spreadsheet you can kind of see on the screen there. What this does, it allows you to measure those improvements year on year. And obviously when we're talking about improvements, we're talking about tracking energy use. We want to think about the actual kilowatt hours you're using rather than how the cost of your energy is changing in terms of the bills. So ideally what I want to encourage you to do is to start taking monthly meter readings. And as I say, this spreadsheet here that will be available with this recording, that gives you a template effectively. You don't have to use that. Use something else if you've got something or you're more comfortable using another system. But this allows you to put in your opening, your closing reading, and we'll look at this again in a second. And as well as how much you've used, and it'll just track it over time, and it'll give you that kind of year-on-year comparison. So yeah, as I say, that will be available with this recording. So do have a look at that. In terms of actually creating that baseline, so there's a few ways we can do it. Basically, it's good I think for almost everyone, it's going to come from your energy bills. One thing I did just want to flag is that when you look at your energy bills, you can see this. There's a box on the slide here, which is the big S, and then 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is your MPAN number, MPAN. It'll be on the first page of your energy bill normally, and it'll be in that format with the big S and then the different codes. What we're interested in is that 0, 1, which is in the little orange box. If that number, if your MPAN starts with 0, 0, that means you've got a half-hourly meter, and what you can do is you can probably either download from your online account or speak to your energy provider, and they should be able to give you a half-hourly breakdown of exactly how much energy you've used, and you can go back. I think it's normally 2 or 3 years you can go back, so you could go back, say 12 months, and look at your energy for the whole of that period. And that's kind of the gold standard, if you like, of energy usage data. It tends to be larger scale energy users who have that, but it's always worth checking. It'll only take you a few seconds if you're looking at your energy bill just to check that MPAN number. If not, obviously what we want to do is we want to look at those energy bills. We want to understand them, and there's a couple of PDFs I've linked to here from National Energy Action, just how to actually read your energy bills. And I hope that doesn't come across as condescending. It's not. I know you know how to read an energy bill, but they're really, really useful documents, and they're worth having a look at just to understand what all the different things are. Because I think a lot of the time what we'll do is we'll get an energy bill, we'll look at the front page, which tells you, okay, this is your charges this month, this is your balance, this is how much you owe us or we owe you. And we'll go, okay, sounds fine. Whereas actually on the back of that, that's the bit we're interested in. That's where your usage is recorded. So looking at the screen there, what we're interested in basically is those meter readings. And as I said, I'd really encourage you to get into that routine of taking meter readings every month, sending them off to your energy supplier. So usually you can do that online. You provide the meter reading, and then your bills are generated based on your actual readings. If you don't do that, what your energy supplier will do is they'll effectively estimate your usage based on previous usage, time of year, that kind of thing, and they can be relatively accurate. But if you've had estimated readings for a little while, and then you remember, oh, I'll give a meter reading, you put it in, your next bill is generated based on your actual reading, that can be quite far from where your supplier expected you to be. So you can either end up with a huge energy bill, or you've got a lot of credit, which, depending on your view of things, you might want that sat in your account, you might not. But ideally, you want to be giving those meter readings every month so that the bills are generated based on how much you've actually used. So yeah, what we're interested in is basically your opening reading, your closing reading, based on that, how much energy you've used that month. The kilowatt hour rate and the standing charge, I'd encourage you just to keep track of as well. So that spreadsheet example I showed, that does have somewhere you can put those in, as well as who your supplier is. And these, although they won't change that often probably, it's really good to know exactly when they changed, so that if you have any issues or you need to come back to anything, you've got that reference there. And again, it only takes a few seconds just to do that as you go. And like I said, if you can get into that routine of doing that over time, you'll build up this picture of your energy usage. And we can go backwards, which is really useful. Helps us to measure those improvements against, but also looking forwards, it helps you to understand how your usage is changing. So yeah, I think if you only take one thing away from this presentation, let it be that. Start doing your meter readings. That's my public service announcement for today. So if we skip forwards, just a very quick one on kind of what makes good data, and I think we have covered some of this already. Consistent, so do those meter readings every month. Get into that routine. Accurate. It's surprising how many from working in this kind of role. It's surprising how many people you speak to who say, "Oh yeah, our meter's not working, or it hasn't worked properly, or we've had this issue with our billing." My suggestion to you is, if you have anything like that which you've kind of been putting off, then get in touch with your energy provider. Get those issues ironed out so that you know that the data you're recording is accurate. If you're like me and you like kind of visualizations, you like to look at stuff rather than read numbers, that can be really useful. So the example there is just kind of monthly electricity use across a year. And actually, ideally, what I should have done is put that from January to December. So what you'd see is kind of a U-shaped curve. Obviously, as it gets warmer, as the days get longer, we're using less electricity, which is what we're looking at in this case. And then as it gets colder again, days get darker towards the end of the year, electricity use goes up. That's the normal kind of pattern we'd like to see, and it's, from my point of view as well, it's looking at what is that baseline, so what is that kind of lowest usage throughout the summer, what's the highest usage, and what's the difference between there, because that's effectively where you can kind of make some of those improvements. The other thing I just wanted to touch on was normalizing data. So this is really, really useful. Looking at your energy data, especially over a long period, looking at your energy data in isolation, it's useful, but it's not ideal. What you actually want to do is you want to compare that against other metrics, such as, depending on your building, I think for most community buildings, the most important one will be usage, or kind of hours of hire, however it is you measure that. You might also want to think about things like floor area, so meters squared of floor space or whatever. If you know you've got ambitions to extend your property, your building, then actually working out your energy use per meter squared at this stage, and then you can look at it again after you've done that kind of building project. That can be really useful. The example I've given here just kind of hopefully shows you how this works in practice. So in this example, we've got energy usage from 2024 and 2025. In between here, so say June 2024, this building, they've installed LED lighting. So when we look at the data, we come back 6 months later, we look at it again in January to compare it to last year. And we say, well, actually, we've used 200 more kilowatts of energy. That doesn't seem quite right. We've made these improvements. We should be using less energy. What's going on? Whereas actually, once we kind of dig into the detail a bit more, we normalize that data. We look at the number of hours the hall's been hired, and I mean, we've got nice bright lights now. It's more inviting. The space is being used more. Actually, the usage is up 50% on last year, which is incredible. When we look at the energy usage per hour of hire, we are actually more efficient. So yeah, hopefully that just shows that how looking at the energy data in isolation doesn't always tell the whole picture. And then my final slide. So well done, yeah, if you've got this far. This is kind of next steps, what we'd encourage you to do. So first and foremost, if you're interested, get in touch. My details are at the end of this slide, this presentation. If you think you might be interested in energy audit, get in touch. We can have a quick chat, give you any more details you need. Again, if you are interested, or actually even if you think an energy audit might be a year or two away for you, start collecting that energy data, start looking at your occupancy data, how you might be able to collect that as well, because that will put you in a really good position when you do come to start looking at things like energy efficiency and potentially energy audits. And then the only other thing to flag up, if you're watching this relatively shortly after it's been uploaded, we have an online session on the 22nd of July at 1 p.m. This is the one I mentioned earlier. It's with Ben Stagg from Stagg Architects. He worked with National ACRE to create this Village and Community Halls Net Zero Design Guide. So this is kind of the guide, I suppose, for community buildings who are looking to improve their efficiency. Obviously, net zero looks at carbon, but actually the way you get to net zero is by reducing your energy usage as much as possible. So yeah, if you can come along to that session, that'd be highly recommended. It's looking at building fabric. So what we mentioned earlier around kind of insulation, different types of insulation, how you can install it, how the kind of impacts it might have, all the kind of practical sides of building fabric and those improvements. So yeah, unfortunately in this format you can't ask questions, but if you do have any questions, obviously my email address is there, my phone number's there, give me a call, give me an email. More than happy to have a chat. But yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I hope it's been useful, and hopefully I will speak to you soon. Thank you.